In what may be one of the most drastic measures we have seen yet, Trump says the U.S. will close the border with Canada to non-essential traffic due to the coronavirus. And this comes just after, around the same time we're hearing Trump administration is taking steps to close border to migrants. Now, this is the southern border, and he's been talking about this quite a bit. Americans, we're officially in this for the long haul. We're not going up, we're not going down, and we're not flying out of this one. We're going to have to bunker down. And what's scary is the timeline being provided. Ain't nobody saying this is going to be quick. We've got numerous sources citing various timelines. Cuomo of New York saying that it could be 45 days until the peak, which means this could be 3 months. Trump had previously said some people are talking about July or August. And now we have a story that the plans could take us through an 18-month shortage, pandemic, etc. It's going to get a lot worse. I don't know. I'll tell you what, man. We'll read this story about the border closing because I think it's kind of, I don't know, funny that Canada is having its border closed to the U.S. I'm not sure I don't know what the point is, I guess. But I'll tell you what, this is frustrating, annoying, boring, and there's literally nothing else going on in the world. You know, the worst thing about all the coronavirus stuff is it's a slow trickle. It's like watching paint dry. I kid you not. Normally on a news day, you'll have a big story come out and they'll say, like, here's something that happened. You'll be like, wow, that happened. Today with coronavirus, because literally every news source is glued to it, it's just like the moment a tiny crack appears, everyone screams as loud as they can. Admittedly, I think we're looking at some serious stuff. So I do think it's important to talk about. We got to stay focused. And I'm getting to the point where I'm starting to think that this is the economic impact is going to be so much worse. And I said this before, the panic could be worse than the disease. But the challenge is, do we do nothing, which results in many people who lose their lives, or do we take the hit? It's the paradox. We're gonna cost millions of dollars. We're gonna cost millions of people their jobs. We're gonna lose billions of dollars. Companies are asking for bailouts. Borders are being closed, and I think it's fair to say you take drastic actions to protect lives and do the right thing. This is why I would never want to be involved in politics. I couldn't imagine having to make decisions like this. Let's read the story about what's happening with the Canadian border being closed. CNBC reports. President Donald Trump said Wednesday morning that the United States will temporarily close its border with Canada to non-essential traffic due to the coronavirus pandemic. We will be, by mutual consent, temporarily closing our northern border with Canada to non-essential traffic. Trade will not be affected. Details to follow. The announcement is just the latest in a flurry of dramatic action in recent days aimed at slowing the spread of the coronavirus. On Monday, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said he was closing his country's borders to foreigners with the exception of American citizens. Trudeau is set to have a press conference on Wednesday morning. On Tuesday, the European Union said it would close its external borders to non-citizens because of the coronavirus outbreak. The border between the United States and Canada is the world's longest border between two countries. On Tuesday, Canadian Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland discussed at a press conference the potentially massive effect of closing the border. Nearly 200,000 people cross that border every day. And that border and that traffic that goes across the border is literally a lifeline for both the Canadians and the Americans on both sides of that border. We get our groceries thanks to truckers who drive back and forth across the border. Very urgently needed medical supplies and medicines go back and forth across the border. And essential workers go back and forth across that border every day. We get it. Can you say border enough times? Jeez. So it's a unique relationship for Canada. And it's important for us in handling our situation on the border to be sure that we act to get things right, Freeland said, according to CBC. I'm going to go ahead and revoke your permit to use the word border. Seriously, calm down. We get it. Pronouns exist. So now, but we're also hearing simultaneously, this from the other day, the southern border is going to be impacted as well. Immigration offices are closing due to, well, nobody wants to get the virus, and courts are closing because the virus has started to appear in the courtrooms. This is from the Los Angeles Times. They say U.S. immigration authorities would soon begin immediately removing migrants who enter the U.S. between official ports of entry and turning them back to Mexico, saying it will help stanch the expansion of the pandemic. The administration has yet to formally announce the proposal, first reported by the New York Times on Tuesday night, but it is hammering out final details. Earlier Tuesday, administration officials began laying the groundwork for the shift. Under the new policy, Border Patrol agents who apprehend Mexican adults attempting to cross the border between ports of entry will return them to Mexico at a nearby port of entry instead of detaining them according to Brandon Judd, president of the union that represents 15,000 agents, the National Border Patrol Council. I find it funny that in a crisis, many of these leftists have found the importance of borders and they've found the importance of guns because they're certainly stocking up on guns and ammo, buying out everything. Many conservatives and pro-2A people already had their supplies. But now I'm not seeing any complaints necessarily. Where's Ocasio-Cortez? Where's the far left to complain about how now asylum seekers are going to be turned away? And there it is. When their safety is threatened, they immediately back down. It's almost like seeing a dog behind a fence yell at you because it thinks it's safe. It can yell and screech all at once. And then as soon as you open the gate, it stops and it backs away like, uh-oh, now I'm actually in danger. Yeah, once people are threatened, they turn to Trump and say, save us. We saw it with MSNBC and we saw it with CNN when they praised Donald Trump. Now we're seeing Trump take action on the borders. And this has been, something people have talked about for quite some time. And of course, the complaints are not there. Now, it's fair to say maybe their focus is diverted elsewhere, but we have this story from Vice. Shutting the U.S.-Canada border is a game changer. The U.S.-Canada border hasn't been shut since 9/11, and since then, we've been doing everything in our power not to close it. This is from Vice, Vice Canada. They say, on Monday, Justin Trudeau announced that Canada was shutting its borders. The list of those allowed in is short. Canadian citizens, permanent residents, and surprisingly, the 300 million plus U.S. citizens to our south. For many, the ban seemed toothless if Canada were going to allow Americans to travel north. So I'm assuming this story, which came out today, missed the letter that they were closing the northern border, and even Americans are no longer going to be allowed in. But I'm interested in see what their perspective is. They say on Tuesday night, CBC and CNN reported the two countries are working on an agreement that will essentially close the border to non-essential human traffic, but keep it open to some trade and make sure critical supply chains are left open. The deal is currently being finalized and is expected to come within the next 24 to 48 hours. If it occurs, it would mark an unprecedented move to stop the spread of COVID-19. U.S. President Donald Trump confirmed the reports Wednesday morning by tweeting, "We will be, by mutual consent, temporarily closing our northern border with Canada to non-essential traffic. Trade will not be affected." While shutting down the border is a massive deal, thankfully the decision was made bilaterally, with trade still being allowed in. It could have been significantly worse, some former political operatives said after the initial border closure. If Canada were not to allow Americans in, there could be the potential for blowback from an erratic president who doesn't handle being rebuked on a global stage. Oh, please, calm down. Can you put down the sword for 10 minutes amid a global pandemic and border closures, Vice? Quote, on closing the U.S. border, please remember, President Trump deemed Canada a national security threat and outrageously imposed S-232 tariffs on steel, tweeted former Canadian Industry Minister James Moore. To assume he wouldn't react to a blunt border crossing ban with an irrational response could be a real threat to the fresh food supply. Okay, wait a minute. Canadians are now scared because they rely on the United States for so much that they're hoping there's a bilateral agreement. So, you know what, man? It's about time these countries started to realize you can't just outsource an entire sector of your economy to a foreign country and then get angry if they close your border. We're learning that the hard way, but we've had people in the United States talking about the problem of China for a very, very long time, notably the president. He's been calling out China and the loss of our manufacturing for quite some time, and many people have smeared or made fun of him for it. Now we're reaping the pain from what we have sown, that we have given away so much of our manufacturing base to China that we don't have the supplies we need. Well, guess what, Canada? You can't just get mad at us when we try to protect our people. China has now started to realize this. Beijing fears COVID-19 is a turning point for China and globalization. Even Bernie Sanders has been criticizing globalization. Seems like it's on the way out. While the world fights the coronavirus pandemic, China is fighting a propaganda war. Beijing's war aim is simple: shift away from China all blame for the outbreak, the botched initial response, and its early spread into the broader world. At stake is China's global reputation, as well as the potential of a fundamental shift away from China for trade and manufacturing. Also at risk is the personal legacy of General Secretary Xi Jinping, who has staked his legitimacy on his technocratic competence. After dealing with the first great global crisis of the 21st century, the world must fundamentally rethink its dependence on China. So many countries thought they could just rely on them for so much. and China manipulated its currency, suppressed wages. That way they could convince businesses in other countries to send their labor to them and they could exploit it. Well, that era is finally coming to a close. I don't know what this will necessarily mean in the future, but I think it's important everyone is a bit more self-reliant. Do you know how much energy is wasted on these gigantic shipping containers and vessels being transported from China to the US back and forth? It makes literally no sense to me. But because the labor was so cheap, China was able to take our manufacturing away from us. And if at any point they wanted to declare war, we would be facing serious national security threats. So it's a good thing. They say, after months of staying holed up in the Forbidden City, Mr. Xi finally ventured to Wuhan, the epicenter of the virus, to declare victory over the virus as all the makeshift hospitals have been closed. Yet no one knows if Beijing's claim that the new indigenous cases are slowing down are true or not, given the long-standing doubt about the veracity of any official Chinese statistics and the party's failure to act in the early days of the coronavirus, not to mention they're expelling American journalists. They're arresting their own journalists and whistleblowers. Now they're kicking out ours. I can only say, I bet it's getting worse for them. And they need to downplay it because they realize the economic hit they were facing was really, really bad. And they need to convince everybody that they can still handle the manufacturing. As this virus gets worse, perhaps people are starting to realize they can't rely on China. No matter how cheap the labor is, it's not worth it. And that is bad, bad news for China. They say the communist government instead is claiming that it has largely controlled the epidemic, even as it suspiciously now blames foreign arrivals for new cases of virus. Leaked video from China shows huge lines at a hospital in Chongqing, for example, raising questions about just what is happening around the country. I gotta say, if the US is planning for 18 months, why should I believe China solved this problem in 2 or 3? Sorry, I don't. Now, it's possible that timeline makes sense because Andrew Cuomo of New York said, expect a peak in 45 days, but perhaps he was basing that information off of what we know about the virus. And unfortunately, much of what we know comes from China, which is probably lying because they're kicking out our journalists. Stands to reason, right? They say what Beijing cares about is clear from its sustained war on global public opinion. Chinese propaganda mouthpieces have launched a broad array of attacks against the facts, attempting to create a new narrative about China's historic victory over the Wuhan virus. Chinese state media is praising the government's effective, responsible governance. But the truth is that Beijing is culpable for the spread of the pathogen around China and the world. Chinese officials knew about the new virus back in December and did nothing to warn their citizens or impose measures to curb it early on. Instead of acting with necessary speed and transparency, the party state looked to its own reputation and legitimacy. It threatened whistleblowers like the late Dr. Li Wenliang and clamped down on social media to prevent both information about the virus and criticism of the Communist Party and government from spreading. So we get it. China has been ever expanding its propaganda campaign to save face. And if that's true, why should we believe any of the information they've put out? Here in the U.S., we are seeing harsher and harsher reactions to what's going on. Notably, the deployment at 18 governors have now deployed 1,500 National Guardsmen. There is a Navy hospital vessel being deployed to the New York area. And New York is saying they will no longer allow, I want to make sure I get the details. I'm going to be very, very, very careful with the details. But they're restricting who can work, how many people can work, and only essential jobs will be allowed. New York is effectively a ghost town. Now, there's a funny viral video where in New York, someone's walking around and people on balconies are yelling at them to go home and they're like cussing about it. But I got to say, stop doing that. Like, if you see someone walking around, for all you know, they're an essential worker. Don't make the assumption that just because someone's walking around, they're just violating some kind of curfew or quarantine. The other thing, too, is, dude, you can go walk around. The issue is don't go around touching tons of other people and don't go into crowded spaces. I think it's absolutely absurd that people are taking the extreme end of everything here, saying either lock yourself in your bedroom or everything's fine. No, I don't recommend going to restaurants. There's still takeout. The restaurants that are being shuttered are offering takeout food services. That means you need to go outside. So people are screaming, stay the F home and all that stuff. Y'all are getting a little extreme on this one, but I get it. So many people are ignoring guidance and just doing whatever they want. There's photos from South Beach in Miami of people partying and ignoring everything. Y'all are nuts. And I mean like literally like, hanging out together and hugging and high-fiving and just all that stuff. And it's like, man, I don't think we need to be between, I don't think we need to be one extreme or the other. But I'll tell you what, we are seeing the deployment of U.S. military sending hospital ships. Apparently, I could be wrong about this, so definitely fact check me. I believe because Cuomo just made the announcement, we are going to now see the deployment of these hospital ships to the New York area. These are good things. And if the National Guard can come out and help us and we can start securing our borders, I'll tell you what, man, I don't see this as being bad for the president at all. I could be wrong. I do think it's difficult, when you look at tribalists. It's like everything that happens with Trump is either always a good thing or always a bad thing, or when something truly bad happens, they don't believe it. But I'll tell you what, we're looking at a wartime-esque president. I think there's a possibility that even if the economy collapses and it's the worst thing we've ever seen, people are going to vote for Trump for two reasons. Out of fear, because they don't want things to change and want to make sure the system is preserved, but more importantly, because Trump is a strong man. When people start seeing what China is doing, when they start getting scared that their security is threatened, who are they going to pick? Bumbling Joe or Donald Trump, who may have messed things up, but he's a guy who won't be pushed around. When it comes to a crisis, who do you want? A timid guy who can barely talk to argue on your behalf, or a big brutish man who's going to push someone down and take their stuff? When it comes to what people need, I assure you, they are going to choose themselves. And that's the point about the border closings. They screech all day and night. You can't do this. Decriminalize border crossings. Now Trump is saying no asylum claims. The courts are being shuttered. I think I have that one right. Immigration judges across the U.S. are staying home after the coronavirus hits courtrooms. All of a sudden, the progressive open borders people have kind of shut up. Because it comes down to whether or not they get what they want. It's the interesting thing about these far leftists and these socialist types, that it's always about them asking for something that they personally need. Now, I can understand if you're having difficulty getting some access to some resources, but if you're not willing to work or you're incapable, that's just the way things are. That's life. You can't just be given something from someone else. But now that we're talking about base level protections, all of a sudden we can close the borders. Trump can even close the Canadian border. Mum's the word. Trump is enacting technically he's getting a bunch of what he wants. There's no more asylum seekers being processed, no more refugees, and the borders are going to be hard shut, and no one's bothering about it. That's what I think is going to happen. After this all subsides, what do you think people on the left who have been mindlessly bumbling along with these activists, what do you think they're going to say? They're going to say, I don't know, just do whatever you got to do, Trump. I'm scared. I don't want to deal with this. What do you think is going to happen now when the ads pop up saying we're struggling to control a pandemic? We can't allow anyone to come in this country. I think you're going to see people backing away from this far left open border stuff like they already are. It'll bring them back. And maybe that's what we need. We're facing an unprecedented crisis, and it's terrifying because people are losing their lives. But at least it's building community. It's not perfect. People are already attacking, Trump, and they're trying to use partisan efforts to unseat him. Now is not the time, at least in my opinion. I think this is the moment where we need to come together and truly recognize what it means to be an American and have a community. The borders are closing. And that's because all of these countries that are shutting their borders recognize it is up to them it's up to them to protect their people, the people they have a responsibility to, and not random people who are coming in. I'm hearing now that Germany is closing its refugee program. All of a sudden, social justice stops. The moment you are in a safety net, the moment when your safety net breaks, no one cares for social justice anymore. It's so easy to complain about oppression when you're safe and you're bored. But when the threat comes to your doorstep, all of a sudden your tune changes. All right, this is just a bit of a wide-ranging rant, I guess. I'm just going to say it. I am so absolutely sick of all of this news. It is just, but it is what it is. I mean, the coronavirus is here. I got another segment coming up for you at 4 p.m. youtube.com/Timcast, and I will see you all there.